But 6 is the reverse. 6 says if the angles here, B and C, are equal, then the sides AB and AC are equal, right? Okay. Now, how does he prove that that is so, right? Then? Well, he says, first of all, that if they are unequal, then one of these sides will be longer than the other, right? Now, it makes, as far as ever is concerned, no difference which side is longer. Let's say AB is longer. Well, then, on AB, starting at B, we cut a line off equal to the shorter one, AC, and starting from B, so let's say it's BD, right? Okay? That's literally a theorem there, that you cut off a line equal to another one. Okay. Then you draw from D to C a straight line, right? Okay. Now you have two triangles, huh? DBC and ACB. Huh? And these two triangles have an equal angle contained by equal what? Sides. Huh? BC is common to both of them, right? And the other side is DB, and let's say this is AC. So you have two triangles having an equal angle contained by equal sides. Well, the fourth theorem, which has been shown already, is that triangles having equal angles contained by equal sides are what? Equal. Mm-hmm. So that's a simple syllogism, right? Huh? Like the one we had there in the first theorem, right? Okay. So you say triangle DBC and triangle ACB are triangles having equal angles, the angles at C and B, contained by equal sides, DB, BC, and AC, BC, right? Therefore, they are equal, right? Okay. But that's not, right? Okay. So, but that follows if you say the sides are unequal, right? Okay. So you're going to have an if-then syllogism. If the sides are unequal, then you can do all this, right? And as a consequence, the part will be equal to the whole. Mm-hmm. But that's impossible. Mm-hmm. Therefore, they can't be unequal, right? Mm-hmm. And if they're not unequal, then they must be what? Equal. Unless you have in a way either or there, right? So the basic argument is either they're equal or they're unequal. And he's going to prove by a separate argument that they can't be unequal, therefore they must be equal. How does he prove, that's an either or solution, right? How does he prove that they are in fact unequal? I mean, they can't be unequal. Well, if they are unequal, then the part would be equal to the whole, the less is greater. Okay? But then, to show that if they are unequal, the part would be equal to the whole, he has to use a regular kind of syllogism. So he's going to use all three kinds of syllogism in one what? Demonstration, right? Another example like that in Euclid, but we'll come back to this after we go through the syllogism. I just saying anticipation, right? Huh? Yeah. You know, and this is kind of a very early theorem, right? And not a terribly unexpected theorem, right? You expect these sides to be equal if the angles equal, right? But in the proof, he uses all three. So you really know all three. And I guess that sometimes Aristotle uses all three too, you know? But here in geometry, you know. Those are the three kinds of syllogisms you'll find. So that's the three that I teach, you know? And probably the other kinds you hear about. Now, the disjunctive syllogism is the one that is either or, and it's almost common sense, right? But there's a few things to realize about this, right? A couple ways you can reason from an either or statement, right? Because sometimes what you do, you reason from either or statement by eliminating all but one possibility and concluding to be what? Yeah. Other times you eliminate all possibilities, right? And then you deny the thing which is being divided, right? Okay? And the syllogism that Thomas gives there in the Summa Conjugata Helix, he says, every name said univocally species, a property, or an accident. And then he eliminates all five of those, right? Therefore, there's no name significantly of God in the creatures. Huh? Okay. But here, you eliminate one, right? And include you made one, right? Now, if you had three, it's common sense. If you had three, you'd have to eliminate two, right? To get one, right? Now, there's a little difference there. In the one case, you know that something comes under this division, right? But you know which number it is. In the other case, you're showing that something doesn't come under something because all the members can be eliminated, right? See? But in this case, here, you know, the two lines must either be equal or unequal to straight lines. Huh? And so, but in the case of the name significantly of God and creatures, we don't know that there's a name significantly, right? And Thomas wants to show that there is no name significantly of God. He eliminates all these possibilities, yeah. So,
Got to keep bringing God down.
yeah. So, and it's kind of common sense of either or. There's no without studying logic, right? And we tend to do that. We don't sometimes even stop to say we're doing that, but we are, in fact, arguing from either or statement, right? Thomas says, oh, you're doing that, huh? There's some attention to this, huh? From either or argument. But the if then is a lot more interesting, right? And there are four forms of if then speech, right? And two of them are syllogisms and two are not. Huh? And I usually put the forms up on the board when I teach this part of logic, and I get 4 students to go to the board, right? And ask them, you know, if something follows necessarily, right under the line, but follows necessarily. If nothing follows necessarily, right, invalid, right? And always somebody will get one of them wrong, right? And sometimes you get all wrong. They'll think something follows and it doesn't. It doesn't follow when it does, right? So now this is a sign that you need logic, right? Your mind is in serious trouble if it thinks that something follows necessarily when it doesn't, or it doesn't follow when it does, right? You're going to miss out on knowing something you could know. You're going to think you know something you don't know, right? And I say it's much. All you have to do is consider those 4 cases, right? Which will meet them, you know. If A is so, then B is so. Huh? I always have stated in this form. If A is so, then B is so. A is so, then B is so. If A is so, then B is so. Now sometimes the mind looks at the antecedent, the part and the if part, right? And you may find out that A is so, right? You might find out that in fact A is not so, right? Okay. Sometimes the mind looks at the negative, and you might find out that B is so, and sometimes you find out that B is not so, right? The question is, does anything follow necessarily? In these cases, about what? B, right? In these cases, does anything follow necessarily about A, right? See? I need to put those 4 forms up on the board, and what do you think at first sight? You know, just to see what it is in the beginning, this part of logic, huh? And actually, one of these forms is a syllogism, and we agree to say it's obvious, right? It follows. One of them is also a syllogism, but not as obvious what follows, right? But we can show it to the obvious form what follows. And 2 of them are not syllogisms at all, right? But people are very often deceived. Huh? And one of them is not a syllogism. Aristotle says in the Poetics is the way Homer taught the other poets how to tell a good lie. So, but you see, we use the or with or with, right? It's a very common form of argument. You find it all the way through the dialogues of Plato, you find it in Aristotle, you find it in Euclid, right? Mm-hmm. And I do these two forms first because they're very simple, right? When you get to the simple syllogism, it's not so simple. Because then you have to consider 48 combinations. Huh? We'll see why. Because the simple statements can be like affirmative or negative, universal or particular. You have 4 possibilities, and they have another variations too. You'll see further. So altogether, if you want to do a complete, there are 48 things to be considered. So I start with the either or, though it's in some sense the least important, and it's almost common sense, right? You get if then, people then tend to get kind of mixed up a little bit on, right? And then the other one is, the more things to be considered, right? That's really kind of the syllogism par excellence, right? Aristotle just calls that the syllogism, And we call it syllogism from hypothesis, And this is used very much in dialectic, right? If you go back to the Meno, you'll see that Socrates uses the if-then syllogism a lot. But he uses the either-or syllogism, right? In there. He uses the syllogism too. And you see that, usually Meno's an introduction to logic, if you have a chance to do that sometime. So we'll see he uses these different forms in there, But it's especially striking the way he uses the if-then, right? If virtue can be taught, then there are teachers of it. But there are no teachers of it, therefore virtue cannot be taught. If virtue is knowledge, then virtue can be taught. But virtue is knowledge, therefore it can be taught. He's using that syllogism, right? But then he'll go back up. If virtue is knowledge, but they syllogism, simple syllogisms, regular syllogism. And
so that would be next.
Yeah, so that first reading then that I gave you, right? It talks about the form of the either-or, which is kind of common sense. And then it talks about which of these are syllogism, right? So it talks about the form of the hypothetical or if-then syllogism, as I call it. And I say this, it's better to have something you can use in a lot of places. This will come up again and again, right? This explains, incidentally, why, once you understand what we're teaching about this, why a scientific hypothesis is never known to be true. Why it remains, as Einstein says, always a guess. You can explain it from this. Because once you realize what ones are not a syllogism, you realize that the confirmation of scientific hypothesis uses what is not a syllogism, then you realize that it ain't necessarily so.
Well, I think you get the data to put the hypothesis no matter what it is.
Yeah. Right.
So these
On his deathbed for having understood everything that he read. That's interesting, yeah? Like I told you that story about he was trying to understand something in St. Paul, and he just kind of dismissed his helpers there and just went down the floor and prayed and wept, and then he woke up. I now understand it. So we all have this one here, which begins the syllogism and form and matter of the syllogism. Now the syllogism, as you recall, is a argument or speech, you can say, in which some statement is laid down. Another follows necessarily because of those laid down. Huh? And these are statements now that are laid down by reason, and laid down implies that they are at rest, in a sense, in the mind in a firm way. Huh? Like in laying down the law, as we were saying last time. Huh? Firmness, and looking forward, you might say, to a conclusion, right? They're being ordered to a conclusion. And the Greek word for premise, is more explicit than the English word, huh? It has the idea of stretching forward, right? And of course, the premises do stretch forward to the conclusion, huh? Now, Albert the Great sometimes says that syllogism is the main subject of logic, because the logic of the first act is ordered to the second act, and the second act is ordered to the third act, and the syllogism is the chief argument, and the third act is the chief tool there of reasoning, and it's kind of the measure of the other arguments, because it's the only argument in which the conclusion follows necessarily when the premises have been laid down. Now the distinction here between the form and the matter of a syllogism. Sometimes we make a distinction, but mainly here on the syllogism, between formal logic and material logic, but they're really one science. But in the one case, you're looking at whether the conclusion does or does not follow, right? And that's what the formal logic is about. While the material logic is concerned as to whether the premises are in themselves necessarily true or only probable, right? Or in some cases even false, right? Now when we do the formal logic, we use letters. And I know from experience, especially if I have female students in the class, everything was fine until you started using these letters. And this is actually, not that difficult, but you could even, back in the logic of the second act, you could sort of consider the form of a statement, right? Universal, affirmative, or particular affirmative, or universal negative, or what? Particular negative, right? You could consider that form apart from what B and A are, right? Okay? Whether the predicate is being said universally or denied universally, or being said of some or not of some, and so on. And you could see that these two statements here, regardless of what B and A are, so long as you have the same thing as B and the same thing as A, the statement every B is A and some B is not A, we could see that those statements are opposed such that regardless of what B and A are, one of them must be true and the other false. They can't both be true, they can't both be false, right? You can see that from the form, right? And the reason why it's, in a sense, useful to sort of abstract the form from the matter is that form can be found in infinity of places. And once you see how these two statements in the form are opposed, it makes no difference what you substitute for B, it's the same thing here and here, and for A here and here. They'll always be opposed such that one is true and the other false. They can't both be true, they can't both be false. They're always two halves of a contradiction, right? In the same way for no B is A and some B is A, right? You're kind of abstracting from what exactly B is, or what A is, right? But if B here stands for the same thing and A for the same thing, then these statements are opposed. And they're opposed in the way we speak of contradictories. They can't both be true, they can't both be false. One must be true, one must be false, regardless of whether you know which is which, right? Okay? And so you can get somewhere just from seeing something just in the form, right? Or you might see that these two statements cannot both be true. They could both be false, or one could be true and the other false. But that doesn't matter which one is, whether they're both false. Like every man is sitting, no man is sitting, is both false. But every man is an animal and no man is an animal. Well, this is true and that's false. Where no man is a stone is true, and every man is a stone is false. But without entering into the matter itself, you can see that these two statements can't both be true. They might both be false, or one might be true and the other false. And with these two statements here, they can't both be what? False. But they could both be true, or one could be true and the other false. Okay? So you can get somewhere on the form below, right? Certain things. And so you're going to find in speech an infinity of statements in these forms, right? Anytime you have a different subject and predicate, you can have the universal, that is to say, right? So B has to be something universal, right? But you're talking about universal statements of the universal subject. Okay? So even in the second act, you could talk a little bit about forms of distinguished or abstracted from the matter. Do you see that? Okay. This is more important when you get into the logic of the third act. Now, we distinguish sometimes three syllogisms, although what we call the simple syllogism in the text here, they call sometimes the categorical syllogism. Aristotle just calls that the syllogism. And then he speaks of hypothetical syllogism. You might speak of the disjunctive syllogism, right? Or the if-then and the either-or syllogism. Now we're going to start with the either-or syllogism, right? And although you can multiply the forms of this by how many members there are in the either-or disjunction, right? Basically, there's really just two things you do. For an affirmative conclusion, you're going to eliminate all but what? One of the possibilities. And for a negative conclusion, you're going to eliminate what? All of the possibilities. Huh? Let's begin with the simplest case where just two members, right? Okay. So you might have X is either A or B. And thus in that case, you don't know whether X is A or B, but you know that X is either A or B. And then you eliminate one of these two possibilities. Let's say we find out that X is not B. Then we could conclude that X must be what? A. That's kind of common sense, right? No big deal. Okay? Now notice that your conclusion here, the subject of your conclusion, is the subject in the either-or statement. Okay? And you eliminate all but one possibility. Now if there's just two possibilities, then you need only one other statement, right? If you had three possibilities, X is either A or B or C, you know it's one of those three, but you don't know which one it is, right? Then you have to eliminate what? Two. Yeah, that's just common sense, right? No big deal, right? As they say. So you might say X is not B, X is not C. So you might have more than two statements in an either-or syllogism, huh? Depending upon how many words of disjunction you have and so on. While in the regular syllogism, simple or categorical syllogism, you always have just two premises. In either-or, you just have the if-then syllogism, only two statements, the if-then statement and another statement. Okay? So take an example there. We're taking the sixth theorem there in Book 1 of Euclid. And Euclid is talking about, in a triangle, if the angles at the base are equal, he wants to prove that these two straight lines are what? Equal. Well, he can see that those two straight lines, like any two straight lines, must be either equal or what? Unequal, right? There's no other possibility. In that case, there's only two. And then by a separate argument, which is also syllogism, but syllogism and if-then syllogism, we'll see, he eliminates the possibility of these two lines being what? Unequal. And he does so because if they're unequal, you could cut off the longer one, like say this is the longer one equal to the lesser one, and then draw a line across like that. And then you have two triangles, this triangle and this triangle, two triangles that have an equal angle contained by equal sides. And therefore, they have to be equal, right? And the part, therefore, would be equal to the whole. It contradicts the lesser, as he says, to the greater. Right? So he shows that X cannot be B. Well, then it must be what? A. Okay? You see that? Okay. Or if you had more than this, it'd be a little more complicated. You'd have to have an argument or reason for denying two of them, right? Okay? Is that clear enough? Okay? Now, the negative, your conclusion, the subject of your conclusion is not the subject of either or statement, but something else is, right? Let's call it Y. Let's say Y is either A or B. There's only two possibilities. In this case, now what you do is eliminate all of the possibilities, right? Right here you eliminate all but what? One. You're going to eliminate all the possibilities. So you say X is not A, X is not what? B. And you conclude what?
Y is not B. I mean, Y is not A.
Well, you conclude X is not Y, right?
Yeah.
See, if X were a Y, it would have to be either an A or a B, because every Y is either an A or a B. But X is neither an A nor a B, therefore X is not what? Y. Okay? Now notice, the difference between this and this, right? One difference was that here you eliminate all but one possibility. Here you eliminate all, right? Here, the subject of conclusion is also the subject of either or statement. Here, it's not, right? But the subject of the either or statement is the predicate of the what? Conclusion. Why here, the predicate is what? The remaining alternative, right? Okay? That's kind of common sense, but you have to stop and see what you're saying, right? Okay? To give an example of this syllogism, right? I'll take a theological example. You know how Thomas, when he takes up an article in the Summa there, he gives objections against, okay? And there'll be some way of answering the objection because they're opposed to the truth, right? But you can still have a syllogism, right? So when he asks, for example, are faith, hope, and charity virtues? He takes the statement that every virtue is either a moral virtue or an intellectual virtue. Aristotle divides the virtues of man into the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. And then he points out that faith, hope, and charity are not among the moral virtues. You go through the moral virtues, right? And you come back and think it's not among the intellectual virtues. Therefore, faith, hope, and charity are not what?
Virtues.
Virtues, yeah. See? That's the form of the syllogism, right? You're eliminating all the possibilities. And now Thomas, when you find that, may point out that well, these are the natural virtues, right? Since they're acquired by natural powers, but these other ones are built on grace and so on, right? Okay. But notice the form of the argument is in this one we have right here. Okay? Now I mentioned how in the Summa Contra Gentiles, when he shows that no name is said univocally of God and creatures, right? There he has a 5-part disjunction, right? He's saying every name said univocally of many things is either their genus, or their difference, or their species, or their property, or their accident, right? Okay? He's taking that distinction of the 5 names, which goes back to Porphyry, right? Made explicit in the Isagoge, as being a complete, right, division of name said univocally of many things. If you follow that part of the course, you'd see, yes, that is complete, right? Okay. Now, he then goes on and shows that no name can be a genus said of God and creatures, and then he shows no name can be a difference, and no name can be a species, no name can be a property and accident. Separate arguments for each of those, right? But the main argument is saying they can't have a genus, they can't have a difference, they can't have a species in common, they can't have a property, they can't have an accident. Therefore, what? No name, right? Said univocally of many things. No name said of God, which is said what? Univocally of them, right? Okay? So in that case, you eliminate all possibilities, right? Okay. You see that?
So one thing that's curious too, in the second and the negative form, you have to introduce a second.
Yeah, another term.
Subject.
Yeah. You see, we do this, as I say, it's almost common sense, and you stop and try to express it, you have to stop and think, but we do it almost automatically, right?
Sure.
I mean, I may be at school, and what night can we get together? Say, well, I can't be here on Sunday, Oh, I got a class on Monday, Tuesday I, play poker or something. Yeah. Now, if you eliminate every day, but let's say Wednesday, you might conclude, well, I get back to our meeting on what? Wednesday, right? This is a common thing all the time. People are saying, what afternoon can we meet for a departmental meeting, something like that, right?
Sure.
And I can't come on Tuesday because I'm up here, say. Okay? And someone else can't come on Monday or whatever, So you might, eliminate all the possibilities but one, right? I often quote that statement of Sherlock Holmes, right? When all the possibilities but one have been eliminated. The one that remains, he says, no matter how strange, must be it, right? So you might have, for example, 3 people who could have murdered so-and-so, right? In the detective thing, And we have a reason why this person couldn't have done it, some alibi, some reason. And a reason why this other person couldn't. Then the third person, strange as he may seem, this highly respectable person or something, right? Must be the what? The murder, strange as it may what? Be, right? With all the other possibilities, but this one have been what? Eliminated, right? But notice again how the difference between formal logic and material logic. If I say either Joe or Tom or Paul committed the murder, and Joe and Tom have alibis that I can't shake, right? Then it must have been Paul, right? But if I don't have all the possibilities, right? And, so someone else who could have murdered him that I don't know about, right? And it's only probable it's one of these 3. Well, then you can go to prison, right, or worse, because of what? That either or argument, right? So that's a common thing, right? Okay. So you can see how the either or argument, the problem is not so much in the form, but the problem is in having a what? Complete division, right? Now it's easy to see that every straight line, let's say, any 2 straight lines would be equal or unequal. And that's the possibility, right? Or it might be easy to see that every triangle is either, equilateral or isosceles or scalene, right? But that every name said univocally of many things is either a genus, a difference, a species, a property, an accident. Someone who does not, learn the doctrine of the isagoge, right, wouldn't know that, right? Okay? So, when Thomas is showing that in theology that the Father is not before the Son, he eliminates all the senses, and which one can be said to be before another, right? Basically what we see in the categories, right? And therefore, in no way is the Father before the Son, right? I guess it's in the Athanasian Creed, it's called the Athanasian Creed, you can find that in the official collection there. The creed at the end of the creed and so on. But there it's explicit that there's no before and after there in the Trinity. But it's hard to see that I've eliminated every, kind of before and after, right? So the problem, is more one of material logic, right? The difficulty, right? Than a formal logic, right? But these same forms, you can repeat them again and again, right? Okay. You could maybe argue in one place that every number is either odd or even. And he gives a reason why this number can't be even, therefore it must be what? Odd, right? Okay. So you can use that same form. There's infinity of possible places where you might use that, right? Okay.
I have a question on the negative conclusion there. When I had said y is not x, now I guess because of the formal logic, you say, well, it follows this particular form. Is there a case if you were to say, well, y is not x, where I don't know if there'd ever be a distortion in the logic there. I mean, because I just think of it as
Well,
mathematically.
we'll come to that question when you can turn a statement around, right?
Uh-huh.
And you have to do that when you take up the second and third figure of the regular syllogism.
Mhm.
You have to talk about when,
Right.
or to what extent a statement is convertible, right?
Uh-huh.
And we'll go through that, right?
All right.
But we'll go through it again using letters, right?
Uh-huh.
It's kind of interesting, right? It's so interesting, for example, that Aristotle will show that if no B is A is true, no A is B is also true. He's going to show that when this is true, this is always true. That's kind of amazing the way he does this, huh? We'll see. Because there's an infinity, right, of possible statements, right, in the form no B is A that are true, right? You can't possibly look at an infinity of statements and see, in every case, the reverse is true, right? So how does he show that every time no B is A is true, but every B and A are? So long as it's true that no B is A, it's going to be true that no A is B. How does he show that? He's going to use letters, right? Huh? He's going to show that it must be so. It's an amazing thing, right? He's showing for an infinity of possible statements, right? An infinity of universal negative statements that are true. That are converse, right? Are also necessarily true. He's going to show, this is not true for every B as A. The reverse is true for every A as B, necessarily, right? We'll take up that conversion, right? Okay. Here, kind of just see the difference between, the way you reason to an affirmative and to a negative statement from an either or what statement, right? Okay. You see the differences between the two now? Okay.
Would you say that you'd have a form to a negative, or why wouldn't you say X is either A or B, X is A, therefore X is not B?
Yeah, but the same thing. I know
Just
yeah,
obvious.
no difference. Yeah, I just chose to do that. Okay. But the main point is that you eliminate all but what? One. And conclude affirmatively to many, right? But then you have to know in your first statement that X is going to be one of those possibilities, right? Okay. So no question about that, right? Easy enough, huh? Now the if then is far more important. And people are very easily deceived with this. Huh? Now I'm going to speak of 4 forms of if then speech. But as you'll see, only 2 of these forms are syllogism. And only 2 of them does something follow necessarily. In the other 2 cases, nothing follows necessarily, right? So, now here we're going to use the letters to represent what? The simple statements that are put together here, right? So we'll say if A is so, then B is so. Okay? Where A represents a simple statement, right? And B another simple statement that follows from that first one, right? Okay. Now, it's going to have that same form in all of these. Now, the simple statement in the if part, they call that in logic the antecedent. It's the name they give to it. And I guess ante means what? Before, yeah. The ante room of the house, right? Okay. And the simple statement in the B part, they call that the consequent. Which at least for the second part there is the one that what? Follows, right? Okay. Now, one thing you notice in the if-then syllogism and in the either-or syllogism it's only your first premise that is a compound statement, an either-or statement or an if-then statement. The second statement, or in some cases there might be more either-or, the second statement or statements will always be simple statements, right? And the conclusion will also be a simple statement, right? And the reason for that goes back to what truth means in these. We want to know the way things are, right? What is so and what is not so in reality. And it's only in the simple statement that you have the truth about things. And, you know, if I go into the courtroom, I say, now, if John murdered so-and-so, then John should be punished. Okay. But you want to know whether John did murder so-and-so, right? Whether John should be punished, right? Of course, if John murdered so-and-so, then he should be what? Punished, right? But did he in fact murder so-and-so, right? And therefore should he in fact be punished, right? Okay? So you want to get back to that fundamental meaning of truth, right? Okay? So, there's four possibilities. Sometimes we look at the antecedent to find out whether it is or is not so, right? And sometimes we look at the consequent to see if it is or is not so, right? No? Now, when we look at the antecedent to see if it is or is not so, we might find out that, in fact, A is so. Okay? Or we might find out that A is what?
No.
Yeah. Either A is so or A is not so. That can be or, right? Okay? And now, from the form of the speech you have now, the question is, does anything follow necessarily from having laid down these two statements, or having laid down these two statements? Does anything follow necessarily about B, right? Okay? When I do this in logic, in the class, I'll put these four forms, separately across the board. I'll get four students, and especially when they don't look too bright. I get the form from the board, and I'll say, now, if anything follows necessarily, right under the line, what follows necessarily. If nothing follows necessarily, write invalid under the line, right? And I know from experience, from teaching logic for years, that I can hardly ever get four students up at the board without some of them thinking that something follows necessarily when it doesn't, or thinking it doesn't follow when it does, right? And sometimes I got all four wrong. And that'd be wonderful, right? But I mean, the point you want to make is you're in serious difficulty, right? If you think something follows necessarily when it doesn't. Because now you're going to be thinking something is true, right? When it isn't. Or if you think something doesn't follow, when it does, you're going to miss out on knowing something you couldn't know, right? So you are in deep, deep trouble, right? You really need logic, right? And then I go through the forms and explain which ones are syllogisms and which ones are not, and why, and so on. And then when they say they all see it, then I say, now somebody's going to get it wrong on the final exam. And experience is clear to that, right? You teach your logic. Somebody, a number of people, will get some of these wrong, right? Even though we've gone through them, right? It shows you how apt the human mind is to make a mistake. In the second book about the soul, Aristotle talks about the early Greeks, and they tried to explain how it is that men and the other animals know, but they did not explain how men and the other animals are deceived. And so Aristotle says their consideration was not complete, right? In fact, animals and men seem to be more deceived in knowing the truth, so that to want to explain what takes place in men, they should explain why they make these mistakes. Okay. Now likewise, this other way of arguing over here, sometimes they look at the consequent, and we might find out that it is so, right? Or the other possibility, you might find out that B is not so. Now the question is, must you say anything necessarily about A from having laid down these two A is so, B is so, E is so. From having laid down these, if A is so, then B is so, B is not so, right? Okay. Well, one of these forms is really obvious, and that is which form?